Mitchell, Tencent's making money on only a sliver of those users. So how optimistic are you about the ability to turn this into a sustainable and profit-making business?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me on. Let's not forget, it actually is already very profitable. It's got operating margins north of 20%, and Tencent Music, or TME, I'll refer to it, is really a platform, just like Tencent has, that is leveraging these 800 million users that TME has, and I think they're going to monetize them in many ways, whether it's subscriptions, social entertainment, whether it's advertising. I think they're just starting to crack the code, and it's around 3.5% of users right now pay, and I think it's going to be multiples higher than that in the years to come. I mean, if you look at a company like Spotify, it's north of like 40% of users pay.
You're an investor in both Tencent Music and Spotify. Spotify is also an investor in Tencent Music, despite the fact that they compete, and they are increasingly competing, especially in Southeast Asia. How does that competition play out?
We don't actually, and I'd respectively disagree with you. I don't really see Spotify and Tencent competing. TME is really focused on the China market, where it dominates, frankly. Obviously in the U.S., Spotify has competition with Amazon and Apple. In China, they're it. Tencent Music, if you want to listen to music online, they own all the major music apps.
Okay, but what about Southeast Asia? You don't believe that they will increasingly, potentially compete there?
Maybe potentially very long term. Look, our thesis, we think of Tencent Music and Spotify as collaborators, not as competitors at all. I actually think the two of them as a combined entity can be a very powerful force against the music labels. I think you'll see them working a lot together, which is why there's the equity interest. TME, in order to monetize and continue to build an enormous business, is really focused on the Chinese market.
Apple Music,
they've got the users.
Okay.
No, go ahead, Sam.
Apple Music is, of course, the main competitor to Spotify, the more concerning competitor to Spotify. Pandora was just bought by SiriusXM. Does that change the game at all?
Not at all. I think Pandora was pretty much irrelevant. I believe, if you poll 100 people in the street and ask how they listen to music, especially anybody under the age of 30, you're going to get streaming. Pandora is old school. It's radio. Streaming is the future, and I believe Spotify and Tencent Music are both very well positioned to benefit hugely from that over the next decade.
But Apple isn't irrelevant. I assume you would agree. So how do Tencent Music and Spotify step up to that?
Look, Tencent Music and Apple don't compete at all. But in terms of Spotify and Apple, I believe that Spotify has I believe in the U.S. that Spotify has a far superior product to Apple, and I think that's how they've gotten to this point so far. Obviously, Apple is a very, very large company that has an enormous amount of resources that it can spend. But in a lot of our initial diligence on Spotify, we started talking to a lot of artists and things like that, and people in the music industry, and it became very clear to us that Spotify is more desired by the artists. And one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the artist tools. So Spotify and companies like Tencent Music that specialize in just music versus Apple that does a lot of things are building these unbelievable tools that enable the artists to get very granular data on their end consumers listening to the music.